From ransomware attacks on satellites to orbital resource theft, space crime isn't just science fiction anymore. As private companies and nations rush to stake their claims amongst the stars, our space assets become increasingly vulnerable to criminal exploitation. Smuggling routes could soon extend beyond Earth's atmosphere, while geopolitical tensions create new opportunities for space-based extortion. But what happens when corporate powers grow to rival nations in orbit? Could we see the rise of modern space cartels or private navies protecting corporate interests beyond Earth? As personal fortunes and grudges extend into the cosmos, the new frontier of crime may be closer than we think. Are you seeing this? All right, get him, boys.
What?
Doing all right there?
Yeah, everything's fine. You seeing this?
My name is Jason Canigan. I'm the founder of Cold Star Technologies, and I wanted to find out what is really going on in space and defense. So I started interviewing experts in the field, and over the past number of years have met with over 150 academics, engineers, business owners, venture capitalists, military, and government officials. I call this effort the Cold Star Project, and it's where you'll ride along with me to find out what is really going on in space and defense. So, the book is Space Piracy, Preparing for a Criminal Crisis in Orbit. And that's going to be published by John Wiley and Sons around the time that this comes out in February. I'm here with the authors, Hugh Taylor and Marc Feldman. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Well, pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us.
Appreciate you reaching out and letting me know about your book. So, I have a bunch of questions from the goofy to the sublime, right? And the first one is like space piracy. Why is this a subject of interest now? Like, why did you pick this to niche down to and write about?
Because as more and more money, investment money, commercial money, and defense expenditures go into space, it is inevitable, and historically, since the time of the Romans, that there will be piracy in criminal endeavors, criminal activity in new endeavors, particularly where there's a great deal of money at stake. The narrative right now has been, it's going to be fantastic. It's going to have all these wonderful things towards Earth. We're going to make a tremendous amount of money in space, whether it be asteroids, on planets, on space stations, and the integration between cislunar and the moon and Earth and interplanetary things like Mars and so on. All possibly going to happen and true, as well as the projections of the economic benefits. Well, with that, that's going to attract crime. And it's going to attract substantial crime and sophisticated crime more than we've ever seen before. So why piracy is there and always has been since pirates basically kidnapped Caesar and he went after them and killed them after he got his ransom. There will be pirates in space. And so people will say, well, Marc, you, pirates in space? How? It's expensive. Well, yes, but if you look at basically an example of the cartels in Mexico, just notationally, collectively, they have 15% of the Mexican economy, if not more. And I know, and basically they've been on a tear in basically diversifying their assets from narcotics and criminal activities into non-criminal activities, whether it be avocado, but particularly in very sophisticated businesses like Pemex. So there's no reason they don't have the ability to finance the space endeavors. If they don't have the talent, they can acquire the talent, just like they do in acquiring the talent to get into fentanyl. They're leaving the Chinese and they're hiring, they're recruiting on universities, similar to what Russell Reynolds or Korn Ferry would do as recruitments to work for them. So what they don't know, they're smart enough to get, and they know what they don't know. Once they understand the activities of space to deploy great deals of money, because space is still expensive, nobody will ever think of cartels or criminal enterprises using space assets on Earth or in space or on planets basically to hide money and eventually basically work and extract money from ongoing operations.
Okay.
One thing I can add to that is that when we talk about piracy in space, people say, oh, Johnny Depp in space in a pirate suit or something. And it's fun, but the reality is it's probably, space commerce will probably mostly be robotic anyway. And a lot of space assets are on the ground too. And that the potential for a criminal actor to take over, hijack a space asset remotely, it doesn't require a lot of money. Alternatively, we've had pushback on the idea from certain people in Washington that, like the same question, space is too expensive. How could a pirate afford it? And our answer has been, well, if you look at like the 9/11 hijacking, for example, those terrorists didn't have to build those planes or buy them. They just stole them. And you might see the same thing happening in space.
Okay, I see. Yeah, very interesting. I've always been a nut for the fall of the Roman Republic. So Caesar and Maximus out there, beating down the Mediterranean and fixing things. Very,
By
very
the way, that
interesting.
is a true
Yeah.
story. He
Mm-hmm.
was
Yeah.
kidnapped, got
Yeah.
ransomed, and then went back to the kidnappers
Mm-hmm.
and liquidated them personally.
Right. Yep. Yep. I mean, it's great press, right? He had his own press machine. I don't want to get too far off topic, but writing stuff back home to share his stories. Um, the cartels is very, very interesting as well, because this idea, I see it in internet marketing. I see it in the agency business, the marketing agency business, where they have a cash-based business. And then they say, well, this is good, but it's very risky. And they take that cash and they turn it into real estate and they become landlords. And now
Well,
it's gone from a risky business to a more stable one, right? And we're
Well,
seeing
remember that these guys,
the
when
idea.
we talk about cartels, well,
Hmm.
we're not just we're not just focusing on Mexican, although geographically I'm in LA and I've seen them,
Hmm.
and they're far more geographically dispersed than you would ever imagine. Case in point, Mexican cartels run a great deal of the oil business in West Africa, in Guinea-Bissau,
Hmm.
and they're not there just
Hmm.
doing narcotics transport; they're taking oil. So
Right,
these
right. Yeah,
guys
you
are the
mentioned Pemex. Yeah.
well, this is very serious stuff
Hmm.
because the money here, people don't think of that in terms of that. So when we say cartels, we mean international syndicates that could have alliances with each other or
Hmm.
in competition with each other or do it alone in their own silos.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, what they understand right now, and they're getting close to space, and you can really address this, is shipping,
Yeah. Okay.
because shipping is rather analogous to the complexity of space in terms of the assets and money laundering
Hmm.
opportunities.
Okay.
And I think that you is actually much more on top of this than I am about a real live incident that happened with a joint venture of Latin cartels and European on the biggest shipping company in the world.
Well, yeah, this is an interesting story. You might have heard about 2 or 3 years ago. The DEA boarded a huge container ship in Philadelphia and walked off with almost $2 billion worth of cocaine
Hmm.
that had been, and it was what they found out was the ship was run by MSC, which is one of the largest shipping companies in the world. But the crew of this ship had been actual crew members were members of a of a of a Eastern European drug gang, and they were collaborating with
Hmm.
Colombian, and they filled this ship. They put a lot of cocaine, and so it was happening right inside this corporate operation, and the owners claimed no knowledge of it. So something similar things could happen, we think, in space. This could
Sure.
be down the road. Just
Yeah.
looking at another issue you are interested in is like, when is this going to happen? And
Yeah.
obviously we don't know, but it's coming. And it's a little bit hard because the timeline is kind of elastic. Like some of the stuff we're talking about in the book could be like 100 years from now.
Hmm.
But we do think that as space commerce gets more valuable, there'll be more incentives to ransom it and steal things and that sort of
We
stuff.
call our enterprise, our book, speculative nonfiction.
Hmm.
And you and I take nonfiction scenarios
Hmm.
and or scenarios or science fiction extraordinarily seriously. So, case in point, in the beginning of the mid 20s, when there was still the silent era around the world in film,
Hmm.
one of the most famous directors in the world when he was in Germany, named Fritz Lang,
Hmm.
him wrote and directed and produced a movie in German called
Metropolis.
Fruity Mon, The
Ah.
Woman on the
Okay.
Moon.
Okay.
Okay. That was a bit of a romp
Yeah.
about treasure and gold and evil people and all sorts of things going on. It was a very successful movie. And the art direction, as usually everything with Fritz Lang, was unbelievably superb. It was a science fiction movie, but it was a very popular movie, and it influenced a couple of people that are very important to what we're talking about right now. One is Werner von Braun, who's in the audience, saw the movie, and Hans Oberith. And those two basically together were very much responsible for the German V2 program as well as others.
Yeah.
Now, when they began their work in space or directing rockets in the mid 30s, the Wehrmacht asked for that movie to be banned, not because it was ideologically suspect, but the art direction was so close to what von Braun and his team were working on that they got extremely concerned that there were basically state secrets, basically that would have been basically doped out. Now we see those scenarios on and on and on about various other things. So piracy is one of those scenarios, as well as criminality, as well as governance issues, which we can get into a little bit later.
Sure.
Now, these powerful cartels are not necessarily going to be the ones that are going to be doing it themselves. They will have talent that they will be able to procure, whether it be in launching, in rockets, in propulsion, and any other component of space, electronics, the most sophisticated. Why? They will have the ability to get even more technologically sophisticated, maybe equal to DARPA, although that's stretching it. We do know historically that during the colonial time, pirates and privateers were responsible for the technological developments of colonial shipping, because they needed a special kind of vessel that would allow them to basically board and liquidate a ship, take the plunder, take the slaves, and get out of Dodge.
Right,
And the
before the
shipbuilders
Navy shows up.
And the U.S. Navy was started by privateers, John Paul Jones. Okay, so it's not, and we know a company that is based in Australia. It's a startup that specializes in, you take an idea of a type of hardware you want, whether it's a rocket ship or a launch vehicle or something on the land or anything on cargo, they'll design it for you based on AI and a thorough scouring of any published material in the world. Then they will give you that material, show you how you can do it, and then you are on your own to have it manufactured, but they'll have the specs for you. It is not out of the question that very smart criminal enterprises will be able to go to companies like this and get designed bespoke for what they need in space to engage in on board or on technological remote hardware for piracy and crime in space.
Yeah. So, yeah, if you don't care where the money comes from. So, Hugh, Marc, you've got me thinking about the space piracy concept differently than at the start of this conversation, because I was thinking about like the colonial pipeline ransomware situation where we inject something, block something, you got to pay me off, and then I'll give you the key to release it. This, if we have a logistics system of transportation vessels that are robotic or unmanned and moving things, and like this gets subversive. Like you've got infiltrators like the Cheka, right? You know, we've got people in organizations and they're putting things on those ships that nobody knows are there, right? And now, like you said, Hugh, we're not building the logistics system or the vehicles. We're hijacking, we're using them, we're stealing them. But this is invisible too, right? If nobody knows it's happening and the cocaine is going in the ships, right?
Right.
You know, this is a form of piracy, I guess, that I really hadn't
It's
thought of.
it's criminality and there's
Yeah.
piracy. Don't think that there's not going to be hostage taking. We wrote a paper on that. In you and I wrote a paper on the day after the first hostage is taken from a space station.
Okay. So this leads to me then to the next question, which is what is worth stealing in space? Tell us a little bit about, you've talked about speculative nonfiction, right?
Right.
Present and possible future assets that are available to be stolen, ransomed, hostages.
Right.
You know, all kinds
Right.
of
Well, it's an interesting question because, you know, if you look at, just to keep on planet Earth for a second, you know, in Mexico, criminal gangs affiliated with cartels are stealing oil drilling equipment in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is an example of what could happen in space, including on Earth, where malicious actors could steal or hijack for ransom expensive like launch-related equipment or ground stations. You know, in the present, in the say the 10 to 20-year horizon, it's possible that criminal actors will make money by stealing or hijacking, you know, satellites or other, you know, things that make money. So if you stop them from making money, it's like the Colonial Pipeline is a good example, you know, blocking satellites. Although what's interesting, we had a very interesting conversation with a gentleman who works with the Lloyd's of London Insurance Group about space insurance. And we're talking about, he was saying like space cargoes, why would you want to insure those? Because right now, basically food goes up and garbage comes down. Like, why would you, right?
And if it explodes, yeah.
Right. But what Marc and I were talking about is that basically, if you look at food, if you stop the food, there's a value to that. I know it sounds, and which gets to kind of a bigger issue that we came at the beginning of the book, which is what is the mission of space? And for, you know, for 60 years, space has been this area of like national honor and heroic, you know, actions by people of integrity. And that's the way a lot of people see space. Well, nobody would ever dare, you know, hijack food shipment to the space station. Well, we live on planet Earth, and human beings would do stuff like
that. The Berlin blockade in space.
Can
you imagine? 1948.
Jason, there's a lot of pharmaceutical companies interested in looking at moleculars of proteomics and various other biological experiences in gravity or low gravity or no gravity, and that's valuable intellectual property. There's also a way so that could be stolen. There's also a great deal, if you understand why everybody wants to go to the South Pole of the moon, that's where they think the resources are. So one of the most classified things that these companies have, like cislunar companies, let's say Astrobotic, or Intuitive Machines and all the rovers and landers and so on. Those are extraordinarily confidential where they're actually going to land in the coordinates there. Now, if somebody got into those systems right there and took that's intellectual property that is extraordinarily valuable. The other thing is basically using a 17th century analogy is where does Musk going to make his money if he goes to Mars? Well, that's going to be cargo ships. That's going to be spaceships from Earth to Mars. Well, that is stretching the analogy just a bit. That's Spanish galleons lumbering from Mexico with silver back to Barcelona, back to Lisbon or on the ports in Spain. Well, that's basically bear to honey, and those ships can be hijacked too.
Absolutely.
Okay, so why not? So and then you can block it off by ransom, as you and I have discussed this extensively, on the ground stations, or even on a more dramatic, take over a spaceport.
Yeah, I think the spaceport or the ground stations would be easier than going out and intercepting the craft. I mean, it would be cheaper, I would think.
Yeah, and then there's a whole concept down the road of privateering and rogue intelligence agencies, or they're all rogue potentially, taking and using non-state actors. The bottom line of all this is the Space Force and the Air Force and the national security establishment looking in space from the NRO and National Geospatial does not yet imagine non-state actors becoming a player in space. That's really
so they're blind to it. Yeah, if they won't look at
it. Not only are they blind to it, they don't even acknowledge its possibility. They don't even discuss it.
But if I have oodles of money from other criminal enterprises and I want to funnel it into this. Go ahead. Oh, come on, I'm editing. What is that alarm?
Emergency alert. Critical business intelligence gap detected.
Cosmic Pebble, Gold Star's supercomputer, has decided that this can't wait, apparently.
This is too important. We're detecting company presidents of manufacturing and distribution firms who are flying completely blind.
Okay. Guess that's why today's episode is sponsored by Internal Business Intelligence by Cold Star Technologies. Without proper visibility into your organization,
you'll lose your performance bonus and damage your track record. Visit coldstartech.com/IBI before it's too late.
Thank you, Pebble. Now let's get back to the interview. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's an interesting debate going on, and we don't have a lot of entree into these circles of intelligence
None
and
of
Space
us
Force and
do.
Air Force, but our understanding is there is this discussion going on that should the Space Force prepare itself for like irregular warfare, irregular threats, and it means to some extent really taking a look at the world a little differently. Like, how does the world actually function? Are conflicts between these kind of established Westphalian states where there's like a president and the government runs the country, or is it between groups like, Hezbollah or whatever that are basically sovereign entities without in all but name, with their own militaries doing things, sort of off the screen. And because space has been such a great power, sort of, basically first it was US and Soviet, then China, like it's, but now we think in the next, say, 5 to 25 years, we think that the defense and intelligence world should look at these irregular threats from non-state actors or criminal gang. And there's a very interesting book called Blood Money by Professor Margaret Sankey of the Air Force University about how there are alliances between criminal organizations and violent non-state actors. If you have a terrorist group, a terrorist group basically is like a multi-million-dollar nonprofit organization.
Yeah.
It has to get its budget from somewhere. So on the other side of the world, there's some gang selling, counterfeit Louis Vuitton suitcases, to fund, the terrorist group, and they work together. Anyway, that's
there's the CIA hiring guys out in the Middle East right now, right? Who had one flag or patch on their bag 6 months ago and traded it for something else. And as long as you're the enemy of the moment, we'll pay you, right?
Yeah.
So it's just the public doesn't look there, hear about it, know about it, or care about it, right? So you do bring up, though, the problem of like nation state enforcement. So I learned a lot about space law from like Christopher Johnson from the what is it, the Secure World Foundation. He gave me a great couple of episodes on that. Dr. Christopher Newman in
Oh, we
Northumbria.
know out of the UK.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, he's awesome. We know him very well. We love him.
Yeah. And Michelle Hanlon is another person. So what you learn are nation states are responsible for the acts of their citizens. These cartels, these criminal agents are members of a country, I'm sure. And then when you pair this with the difficulty of enforcing judgments from international courts, right? Where do we go from there? Or do we get a bunch of like powerless judgments and then all the nation states go, well, damn, I guess we need to turn some of our money into police cars.
I got it. So
space.
let's start with a story.
Yeah.
A real true story. Back in the early 50s, as the Soviet Union was consolidating its gains from the war, one of the big prizes for Stalin was Poland, and it was actually quite brutal with Poland. So the Pope at that time, I think Pius XII or something like that, called Molotov, the foreign minister, into his office. I'd like to have a talk with you, and he basically said, "I'm really very disappointed in what's going on with the Catholics and the citizens of Poland. And I just want to express, I wish you would basically, stop." And Molotov, as a diplomat, listened and reported back to Moscow and goes to see Stalin. And he tells Stalin, and Stalin's listening, and he puffs on his pipe and he says, "Tell me again, Comrade Molotov, how many divisions does the Pope have?" So
right.
It punctuates what you just said. You could have all these UN and all these treaties about who's going to do what on the moon. But when they get there, it's going to be who's going to have the enforcement capability. We're not living at the time when the Portuguese and the Spanish cut a deal with thanks to the Pope. And even the papacy was waning in the 1600s. That's not going to happen. And so you're going to have, as you and I believe, or I believe strongly, there'll be 3 silos up there. Silo A will be sovereignty. Okay? And it'll be more. It'll not going to be just the sovereignties of the United States and China and Russia and Japan. People don't think Japan's going to be a player up there, and I believe it's totally wrong. And then you're going to have India, and then you're going to have Germany will be a player because now with the automotive business in Germany, all those smart engineers are going to go to work for OHB up in Bremen, and Germany is going to have a space business because Germany has not signed any ESU or any EU document space. They kept that in their back pocket. And Germany has interesting relations with Israel on space programs to the moon. You got India, you're going to have all these other little countries that are going to want activities in space. That's sovereignty. On the other extreme, you're going to have criminal organizations that I believe are going to be not just wreaking havoc and stealing low-hanging fruit. They're going to be actual operating entities up there. And you can do that in several ways. Take Mexico, for instance. The cartels, which we don't have a great deal of income, they can basically tell the president of Mexico, we're going to put something hidden in the jungle here, and we're going to create our own space industry, and we're going to hire the best people we can from all over the world, like from Roscosmos. We're going to basically hire a great deal of dissatisfied SpaceX people who didn't get that senior VP job, or people in the Space Force who didn't get their first star, so on and so forth. You can see where this is going. In the middle, so you got extreme A and extreme B, and right smack in the middle of that are going to be non-state actors like corporations like the British East India Company. And that's when things are going to get, I believe, real wild, because they're going to have to hire protection or enforcement agents, whatever they do. Now, those enforcement agents, these mercenaries, have a tendency, as we know from Italian experience, to basically turn on their masters. So then you're going to have the Space Force dealing with not just sovereignties like China. You could have weird alliances. I'm just speculating at the top of my head right now. The United States and China basically deal with a threat of non-state mercenaries basically grabbing their plunder on the moon or whatever.
Okay. And if you are the president of Mexico and the cartel says we're going to put this here and hire all these people, maybe you should roll with it.
Well, that's a conversation.
Say,
that's a conversation
legit,
President Scheinbaum is going to have to deal with. But
wow, and it's not to say these people going to work for the cartels might not even know it, right? It could look very legit.
You want to address that because we've discussed this basically deracinates KYC because if you're a hedge fund, and the hedge fund has positions in, let's say, semi-mature companies, your major limited partners could be cartel-oriented or affiliated through various companies that are hidden beyond in places you would never, ever imagine. And one day you can get a phone call and say, we'd like you to do this, and we've just found out, oh, we're your largest shareholder.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
What are you going to do?
That could be a process for technology transfer also. This is something that's come up. We read interesting paper by Professor Mahoney at Cal State talking about private equity in the defense industry and how bankruptcies and private equity firms could be kind of a Trojan horse for
non-state actors
or people, people you don't want at the party to, come and see your sensitive patents and things like that, and in space. So it's a problem.
Okay. Hugh, I think this might be a question for you.
Yeah.
What similarities do you see between cybersecurity and space piracy? And I'm going to go into this a little bit. I go back to James Mickens, who was a guy making videos in around 2016 and that, talking about the lack of security or the security vulnerabilities of the Internet of Things. So your smart light bulbs, your smart fridges, stuff like that. I have cameras in my house. They are protected by username and password. We could probably guess the username is one of my email addresses. And then the password, it could probably be just broken by brute force, right? I had one thing that I signed up for recently. I don't remember what it was, but it would not let me choose a special character. It was like 8 digits, numbers and letters only. And I know, I'm no expert in this field, but I know a special character makes it, 10 times or 100 times or whatever harder to break. And I thought, wow, the manufacturer here is making it easier to break into. So, is it going to be the case that objects that are being attacked, from ground stations, let's say, are going to be as easily taken over as somebody's in-house camera or something?
Right. Well, it's a really important question, and I think that cybersecurity is relevant to space because almost all space systems are dependent on computers and computer networks. And there's a general principle in cybersecurity that the sort of more complex a system is, and the more entities it connects to, the less secure it gets. So you have these chains of connection between corporations and government entities and hardware and space. You have gaps which can be exploited by malicious actors. But to answer your question, I think as of now, it's not really a big issue. I mean, I'd like to think that the hardware that goes into space has better security engineering than consumer IoT devices, but you never know.
Yeah.
I have a colleague who examines firmware, which is like the software that sort of runs the device itself. And he said it's installed at the factory, which is almost always in China. And he said, you can't imagine what's in this stuff. It's like it's shocking how much security risk is there. But there's a couple of things protecting space assets from hackers. One is that most space systems, satellites, have like two operating systems. There's the command and control C2 operating system, and then there's the application. So it's two different systems. One runs the satellite, moves it around. The other runs the camera or whatever is on it. So it's hard, it's difficult to hack. You have to hack both basically to do it, and that's hard. And then you also have to hack a ground station. So we subscribe to a theory espoused by Professor Martin Libicki at the U.S. Naval Academy. He's written sort of the authoritative book on cyber security for warfare, is that any situation where you have to hack two systems at the same time, it's a lot harder to succeed. Because if you're depending on hacking system A in order to hack system B, like at the same time, it can be done, but it's like a lot more resources. So this is one of the reasons we think that space has been harder to access. But this is starting to change, though, because more and more, first of all, there's more computer hardware going up into space than before. They're just it used to be that the satellite would send the data down to Earth and the computers were on Earth. Now they're putting the computer and the storage and the data analytics in space because it's a lot easier.
Right.
But that means sending up these sort of off-the-shelf systems like Intel hardware, Linux operating systems, which are a lot easier to hack than some of the weird proprietary specialized stuff they have now. So as that proliferates, you'll see, we think, more space hacking and space, paralyzing of space assets by hackers.
Okay. Cybersecurity incidents they're kind of hard to see by the public, right?
Yes.
A password break or a credit card company, hack or something like that, right? We hear about it. We know it costs an awful lot of money. We, as public, we don't really understand the long-reaching effects of it.
Right.
Is space piracy going to be like that, or is it going to be more, I don't know, in your face, with kidnappings and ransoms and things
I
like
don't,
that?
obviously, I think what will happen, we had a nice review of our book from Barbara Barrett, who's a former Secretary of the Air Force. And one of her comments was that the average American uses space throughout the day.
Yes.
With GPS and many satellite television, all kinds of things like this. And so I think if these services get interrupted, like if you can't listen to Howard Stern on Sirius XM radio because of a safe, then there's going to be like rebellion, like.
So how much does it personally impact them?
Right.
This is interesting because
See, there's
more
a
impact
there. Yeah, let me punctuate that on that. If you listen to these intelligence officers and operation guys in the Space Force, they all talk about AST, anti-satellite warfare. That seems to be the big thing. Many thoughtful articles on how to protect that. My take is that's limited to just that. We discussed a little bit about ground operations, which are extremely easy to get into, except maybe Vandenberg and some of those other places. And then you got the space stations, and particularly the commercial space stations, like what Axiom wants to do, and what Sierra Nevada would like to do. Those are so vulnerable. and will be, and you could possibly slip in things right now as they're being built, or look at the subcontractors, let's say with Theos, I believe Theos, and maybe they were or were not doing it with Axiom, and that you can embed things in there for a long time. And again, criminal organizations, I mean, you can think, well, maybe state actors, intelligence services would do that, and possibly so. But criminal organizations also have that sophistication. We know for sure that the Sonora cartels had a whole string of security cameras on the San Diego, Tijuana border. And Colombia cartels back in the 80s had their own intelligence services.
Okay.
So, you know, these things progress, and there's no reason they can't access similar open source information as we do, and possibly even classified stuff based on who they bribed or have threatened.
Yeah, you made me think of Rhonda Stevenson, who's at Above Space, right, with their in orbit space station plans. But last time we talked, she mentioned like a space cannon that could fire something from orbit into location very, very quickly. And this would be good if you needed emergency supplies after some kind of horrible event. But what if you had something else in that thing, right? You know, we could put Ebola wherever we want, or right, or arm a whole bunch of people all of a sudden. So,
well, there's a need for we've had conversations with people about creating space sidearm weapons.
Yeah, because you don't have air and
see, there's no law. See,
we're back to Moonraker.
There's a gap. There's a gap between law enforcement capabilities,
yes,
and intelligence capabilities. There's a gap in space. Law enforcement doesn't have any real connection there. The only intelligence agencies is only because of the title, one of the titles that gives the Space Force law to do. They're the ones that have space. So, and a lot of agencies don't want to touch it. I can tell you for sure, and people that I've spoken with, the CIA and other agencies don't want anything to do with it.
Right. I mean, we recently had a U.S. satellite that blew up, right? And nobody really knows why, right? You know, I'm thinking about realpolitik, nation states. You can't really tie a nation state down to understanding their goals, because as soon as their capabilities improve, their goals expand, right? Why would we think the bad actors would be any different? Right?
Well, actually, you and I and you may think that, but they don't think. The problem is with you and I would talk about this ad infinitum that in the Pentagon and in the intelligence branches, they don't really get crime, except maybe the Navy, which was birthed by going after crime or piracy, like in the North Africa, which has, you know, the Maghreb. Okay.
Yeah. I have to explain Lagrange points one more time.
Cheer up, Jason. I've quantum leaped your productivity problem.
Pebble, that's not how quantum mechanics works. Greetings, original version. Ready to revolutionize some space propulsion? What in the name of Sikorsky's rocket equation is going on?
I've created a superposition of Jasons. Isn't it elegant?
It's not, you can't just, no, let's not collapse this wave function of opportunity. I've got some fascinating ideas for you. Dark matter. Pebble, we talked about this. No messing with fundamental forces.
Oh, please. What's the worst that could happen? A little vacuum decay. Never hurt anyone.
They don't get it. They don't understand crime. They understand Chinese military doctrine. They read the papers. They get it. The DIA translates all this stuff, and the CIA's analysts translate, and everybody translates all the sovereignty doctrine. But are they looking at the? Do you think Sonola has like memorandum floating around? You know, it's different. It's decentralized.
Right.
You know,
and it's not written down either. There's no manifesto or operating manual.
All criminal cartels are different. You know, I mean, the Mexican ones.
We need Libyan pirates to fight in space to get some knowledge about this stuff and some experience in how to handle it.
Our point is, it would astonish you at who would be involved in it. It's not that predictable. The Chinese are somewhat predictable because of geopolitical, because those guys go to the same universities and have the same professors as at Georgetown or at Harvard and all those places. The Sonola guys don't have that, don't they? They operate the way they operate because they operate and they'll take, they're extraordinarily, they pivot when they see an opportunity and they're ruthless. And so when you discuss, is it going to be discreet? Yeah, but sometimes the marketing strategy of Mexican cartels is to be the more violent ones.
Right.
So it could be very possible that to introduce themselves to the universe, they could blow up a space station if they're not getting $50 billion.
Right. Make it as violent as possible so that we get the message.
But that's a marketing. That's a calculated marketing objective and execution, just like any other large transnational corporation will have it for whatever product or service they want to market in the most efficacious and large way possible.
Okay.
I mean, another angle, another dimension of this that we talk about is that, and we've had some validation of this idea from different people, is that nation states may use pirates for deniability. And this is happening in the cyber world, where there's a hack and everybody sort of knows it was done at the behest of the Russian government, but they're like, oh, we don't know knowledge of this, but it couldn't be us. We have no control over these things, but we and some people in national security, arena think this is possible, that you'll see attacks on space assets that are deniable, but it's coming from somebody, it's a nation state.
Okay. So who has the capability? And that comes back to intelligence services, and they're not looking, in your opinion. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to go to that for one more second, we're not criticizing. I just think nobody's been tasked with this. It hasn't been on the radar screen. It hasn't been a priority. It's in the future. But our feeling is this is the time to start thinking about it.
Yeah. Okay. And if they don't listen, we're just going to have to wait until we get a satellite with arms like Gordon Ressler designed for DARPA that could fly up to another satellite and grab it.
Look, here's the time. Let's be succinct.
Yeah.
The intelligence community was started because they don't want another Pearl Harbor event. This is the time to think about these things in the most dramatically imaginative way. So there is not a Pearl Harbor event, as I just described, or I can even go even farther in space. We haven't even gotten to the governance. What happens when you're on a asteroid or something like that? But that could be, time may be prohibit that conversation. Right now.
I wanted. Well, no, I mean we can cover that in two questions, because I did want to bring up like the mining courts of the Old West in the U.S., right, where they came up with their own courts because there weren't states and government to handle it. Yeah, go ahead. But we could hit that now if you feel like it. Sure.
Shall we talk about Franco? Let's talk about Franco for a second.
So
that's a very good opportunity.
Like me has a love of history, I see. We could probably talk for hours about that. So this is Spanish Franco.
Well, it's like Faulkner. It's not even history. Okay, so let's assume a little far out in the future, but not that far. There's a habitation someplace. Now that habitation is going to be extremely restrictive. Because you've got, technological sophistication that has to be in place. If you're going to have all the breathing and all the various living things, you're going to have the right kind of people there and so on. But not, because you're going to have evolution and you're going to have human beings are going to be human beings. So you're going to have, my thinking is that it's going to be rather dystopian. And we're like this. During the Third Reich, there was a gentleman by the name of Ernst Fraenkel. He was a Jewish, young Jewish individual who got his law degree and his permission to practice law in Germany about 3 weeks before Hitler came to power, signed the Enabling Act, and then prohibited Jews from being in the legal profession and all the other ones. He was extraordinarily upset, and he sued the Nazis in a Nazi court and won.
Impressive.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that got him to think. And then there was another incident that really got him thinking, that there was an SA. We don't know whether it was an officer, it's unclear in the book, but he writes about an SA, an individual employed by the SA who was discharged, who was fired. And that individual sued the SA. And the Enabling Act allowed that Hitler's word is law, and that was it. That was the final law. But the courts found, and they, as they will for found for Franco, no, because there's a 250-year tradition of German law that would govern things like, oh, well, divorce and disputes and robberies and things like that, that police and other issues and civil thing would do. Hitler's law could overcome that, but in certain cases it can't. So that SA individual basically was able to win because Hitler's word was for the institution, not for the individual. So they forced the SA to pay up. So he created this theory of what they call the dual state. That on one hand, in a dictatorship, and the cartels run like this too, you have these criminal organizations running things. But at the same time, underneath that, you have a normative type of legal system and society. And it's my belief that when you get to an ongoing habitation in space, you're going to have criminals running it.
Okay.
Musk may think he may want to run it, but he's never disclosed how that's going to happen, or all the cislunar or all the mining companies. But it's not necessarily, I mean, I'm not being predictive here, going to be what they think it is as a technological, oh, we're going to have to follow these laws and so on. Those laws will be broken, and there will be activities that will go, who's going to be jockeying for power, and people could take control over the life support systems of these places,
right?
And say, pay up, or we turn it off. And we've already planned for this, and we have our own alternative thing, and so the hell with you. Or they basically want supplies and hijack supply ships and say, you want that supply ship to get to the moon, pay up.
Okay. So yeah, once again, you think you're doing a good thing, but they'll find their way in, the bad guys. So what mechanisms
that proves they're making
have?
money, though.
Yeah.
That proves we have.
And from a commercial space perspective, yay. Good. So what mechanisms do we have for keeping things under control, at least with, to not have the lid come off the pot as it boils over, right?
Well, first of all,
we accept that there's going to be some chaos, I guess, is the starting point.
Understand the pot could very well boil over.
Okay.
Understand the various weaknesses in the node, but these things are evolving so quickly. And there's the commercial aspect. But if you look, Jason, and you're close to this too, the militarization of space has always been with us, always has been, and always will be. It just gets more and more. And then you're going to have issues of the militarization of space that'll be almost a complete 100%. And then basically all these little companies, or these medium-sized companies, will be very much at the mercy of the strategy of the military, of MIC, of the military industrial complex. And that's going to be policy decisions and so on of how they think of it, but it's how you view it. Now, if you are living in an environment that is purely technological, then you're going to basically be a prisoner of that technological, meaning space. Oh, that's why it's too expensive. You're not going to have criminals up there. But in the early days of aircraft and fighter pilots, the fighter pilots, when they were basically being introduced to these fancy avionics, wouldn't trust the sensors for missiles. So they would basically not ignore that, but they would look out the window because they knew they were in a bubble and they had to look out the window. My take is, I speak about this constantly, is it's becoming more and more important to be able to look out the plane, to look outside the window. And if you can do that, you may be a little closer to seeing there are some very interesting issues and also opportunities here to combat this. So just as you can create a Corsair on demand, if you're thinking ahead and you're seeing there could be this type of policies or not, then why not create a police cruiser in space that could mitigate that before it even happens?
Difficult, but possible. I'm thinking there was that Kelsey Grammer movie about the development of one of the personnel carriers that turned into a huge debacle.
Yeah.
It was hilarious, but
I love Kelsey Grammer.
Everybody just tried to keep tacking on what they
Right.
wanted to it, and it just ruined it. I'm thinking about David Weber, who's an author, and he did these science fiction stories that are kind of set like with a British Empire in space with an admiral of the blue or whatever, or the white, and then a French sort of communist type thing, and pirates and things like that. And I don't know. I mean, will we see commissions for piracy issued by nations against opponents because they don't have the capability, but the third party does? Or is that
Privateering?
ridiculous?
It could happen.
Privateering.
It could.
We wrote a paper on that.
We just wrote an article about it. Yeah, it could happen, and there's some people who agree with us. It may be less of an official thing.
Yeah.
I don't think like you could go to Congress right now and ask for a letter of marque to be a space pirate. I mean, you could always ask, but
Okay.
I think another sort of additional way to look at this issue is we see three kind of areas of activity for getting on top of crime in space. One is sort of the official diplomatic United Nations treaty kind of layer.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this weird thing where there's no space law is very vague, but there are certain things that could stick, like an American-built lunar base is probably subject to American law and American sovereignty, certainly for Americans who are there. Getting them back to Earth for trial might be difficult, but at least in theory, like I said, the lawyer explained, like, in order to have a crime, you have to have a jurisdiction and a law and law enforcement. So, you have to have those three things. But there's that layer, which is necessary. But then there's probably the clandestine intelligence operations world layer of this, where things are just going to happen and people are going to get, mysteriously killed or whatever. And then there's the corporate and financial layer, which we think, whatever form it takes, and it could be something like a British East India Company or something as simple as an example of, if you ever read what happened with Exxon when they bought a gas company in Indonesia, they inherited a war. They bought like 100 gas wells on some island, and there was a war going on. And all of a sudden, all these people in like New York City were had these very uncomfortable conversations like, well, are we going to pay our private security guards to kill these people? And they're like, well, heavens, no, we would never do such a thing, but like it was happening. You know what I mean? So you may have that sort of thing going on, where corporations just have to make decisions about how they're going to enforce their own rules as if they were the law, we think, in space.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Okay, so let's talk about chapter 10 in your book, which is about the recommendations that you have chosen to start with. I haven't seen them because I've seen a proof of about the first 50 pages of the book, which I devoured, as you know.
Right.
I was like, oh, scene missing. Okay, so so I'm gonna have to wait till February like everyone else. But tell us, give us the teaser of the first at least few things, I guess, that you recommend.
So I actually what I was just talking about were some of the recommendations. I mean, our basic recommendation is that it's time to talk. We have to. Marc and I consider ourselves conveners. Neither of us is there's no authority on this topic, but like there's a lot of amazingly expert people. There's people from different backgrounds that need to come together and discuss and figure out a plan, because there's time. We use a cyber example of what not to do. Like the current cyber nightmare in the world is the result of terrible decisions that were made 60 years ago with the best of intentions about open systems and open architectures and all this kind of stuff, which has led us to a disaster. And there's an opportunity, we think, with space to avoid that and figure out, secure engineering principles, rules for conduct, and that sort of thing. And we think it would involve bringing people from different backgrounds together, what we call multi-threaded dialogue, like, that the Air Force is going to talk to the insurance industry, and the Space Force is going to talk to investment banks, and the CIA is going to talk to, rocket manufacturers. And this is our hope. And we got some interesting advice from a person who had a lot of experience in the State Department. Her recommendation is, try and figure out the principles you want to follow. Principles come first, and then rules and regulations later. And it was an interesting perspective that, if you can create consensus. Now, of course, there's a lot of problems later. How can you enforce it or whatever? But if you start, like, we have agreed, this is what it should look like. And then there's probably certain changes of mission for certain organizations. Like, for example, Marc and I have talked a lot about, and we've talked to some people from the intelligence world, that there is this gap in the intelligence world, as far as we know, about irregular threats in space. This needs to be dealt with, but that could be a 5 or 10-year process to sort of conceptualize an organization like this, figure out who's going to run it, who's going to pay for it. But we think now is the time to think about it. And that's the basic recommendation. Marc, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, the high-end principles is really a pretty good place to start, because if you have those high-end principles, then it's flexible when the realities change, and they inevitably will change. And you want to bake into that DNA the surprises that you're not thinking of. And that's what space probably will entail. On one hand, it's a very structured environment because of the the ability you have to plan for launches or for payloads and this and that. But as we know, nobody 2 years ago thought of Houthis wreaking havoc with international shipping.
Mm-hmm.
So who were the Houthis in space?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right. And
You got to be
often funded by
have,
Iran. Yeah.
or somebody else
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
we don't know.
Yeah.
Or we're not thinking of. I mean, nobody thought of Yemen as anything except maybe some sort of weird drug that everybody chews, or a cat or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
It'll be something like that, is what in other words, let's take the depression, leave on this note. Historically, everybody felt that there was going to be some major economic calamity in Europe in the late 20s, early 30s. But it was some little shit bank that nobody ever thought. Sorry for the language, I better delete that one. So it was some little bank in Austria that collapsed, and that basically put everything in the hell in a handbasket in the 20s, early 30s.
Okay.
I forget the name of the bank.
It's so interesting to look at the history, Marc. I really wish we could talk more about the British East India Company and what that might look like in space.
We could go on forever
the
on
Hague,
it. Because
just for our listeners, The Hague, being the center of Dutch power, and the Dutch used to be huge, right? They had ships running through the Dutch Indies, right? And the sailors would get off, go on an island, see an animal, draw it, write a report that would go in triplicate, and one copy goes back to The Hague. And in the basement of The Hague, there are reports that have never been opened since the 1700s, and that fascinates me.
It's the same thing.
What's in there?
The British East India Company had their own army and navy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
So
I've watched a few shows about it.
We don't know that formative aspect they're going to take. We don't know.
They don't even know what intellectual property they have. That's what's astounding to me.
The point is, it's there. Why is Luxembourg in space?
Mm-hmm. Right. Why is it involved?
What goes on in Luxembourg?
Right. Banking.
Well, that's all dodgy.
Well, the theory is that people are going to be setting up opaque shell corporations to operate in space.
They're doing it now. Yeah. That's why they want to be a player. For goodness sakes, they're hiding money right now.
Yeah. I mean, I could go there for sure. So
that's
very, very interesting. So instead of waiting around for us to get punched in the face by a Pearl Harbor space piracy,
this is the time to examine what
you guys have written this book, and thank God for it, because I've been trying to write a book of some kind on geopolitics for like 2 or 3 years now, and I can't figure out what the point is of what I want to share. I got all this information, but no, like, what am I trying to say, right? And you guys, I was impressed by that, right? You guys focused, and you're like, this is really
thank
good.
Thank you. But more importantly, thank you for the time and giving us sort of a venue to discuss it with somebody that sort of really gets it. We've been very fortunate. We haven't had a lot of giggles on this. At first there was, oh, come on. But once people listened a little bit, then there were no more giggles, and we got to talk, and it's been a pleasure. And just thank you.
Well, appreciate you guys. My guests have been Hugh Taylor and Marc Feldman. The book is Space Piracy, Preparing for a Criminal Crisis in Orbit, coming out from John Wiley & Sons, February 2025. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thank you.